It's very much in keeping with this year's conference theme that our opening keynote presenter is Seaburn Fisher. After founding and developing services in family planning in the 1970s, Seaburn ran a residential treatment program for severely disturbed adolescents in Western Massachusetts. While running innovative programs, Seaburn could see that these people needed more than talking therapies alone could offer. Since beginning her learning and work in neurofeedback in 1996, Seaburn has authored a seminal work in this space, Neurofeedback in the Treatment of Developmental Trauma, Calming the Fear-Driven Brain. Since that time, through teaching and mentoring, she has supported the work of many hundreds of clinicians in this area, facilitating recovery for many thousands of clients affected by developmental trauma. Seaburn was the recipient of the Joel Lubar Award for contributions to the field of neurofeedback in 2013, as well as the recipient of the 2017 MB Sturman Career Achievement Award and 2020 Fellows Award from ISNR. To my mind, Seaburn exemplifies what we need in the area of neurofeedback in trauma. She has the curiosity, analytical mind, and rigor of a scientist, combined with the warmth, compassionate heart, and intuition of a gifted therapist, as well as the passion and energy of a fearless advocate. Welcome, Seaburn.
Wow, thank you so much. Okay, now let's see if this fearless advocate can get her screen up. Okay, share the screen. Okay, so am I shared? Yeah, I'm shared, right? Okay, let me go up. Okay, first of all, I want to congratulate you on your 25th Silver Jubilee and thank all of the staff at ANSA for inviting me. Thank you, Jillian, for that wonderful introduction. And to wish you all good morning as it starts to get dark here. I'm with you in Sydney or elsewhere in far-flung world. I wish I were there in person. But I am, as I often do, talking about trauma. And I want to make sense of this title, Walking the Tiger and Letting It Sleep. If it's not intuitively clear already, I will make it clear. So when a friend of mine handed me this book by Peter Levine, and which those of you who have read it will know is called Waking the Tiger. And it was a transcription error in my own brain that I called it Walking the Tiger. But it turns out to be the right title for if I were to write a book about this, because this is what we're trying to do, in my mind, in the field, or working with people who have suffered developmental trauma. What our goal is to quiet fear, to tame the tiger. It's just by way of anecdote, Mariana was also there at Plum Village, which is a retreat center, a Thich Nhat Hanh's retreat center in southern France, and sharing a house with other people and with Peter Levine and his wife Laura. And we were up at the Upper Hamlet where the conference was going on, which is a Neuroscience and Buddhism conference that Peter was speaking at, as well as myself. And we were, I just remember we were standing by the swing, and he said that he felt that neurofeedback and somatic experiencing were the future of trauma treatment. And I asked him if he could elaborate on that, and he said, quote, "It's a no-brainer. somatic therapies arouse, can swamp people in fear. And what what they need is to have a brain that's not reactive to fear. So that that was his vision of the future of trauma treatment. I also wanted to say that I think that one of the goals of this talk is for all of you who have made this incredible investment of time and money and energy and learning and paradigm shifting and rejection and all the things that go along with doing neurofeedback. I want you to know at the end of this for sure and definitely that you are in the right place at the right time. There is no other conclusion to come to, hopefully, by the end of this presentation. Okay, so to walk the tiger, we have to find it, to quiet it, and we have to find it. So it turns out, of course, that the tiger is not a tiger at all, that the tiger is a reptile, closer to a crocodile or a snake. And this is going to be the focus of the protocols, but it's also the focus of the research. There's more and more research that is taking us to the back of the brain, particularly to the brainstem and the reptilian structures there that are evolutionarily conserved. They exist in the reptile, they exist in the mammal, and they exist in human beings in some form, these structures. And they're calling the shots in developmental trauma, these brainstem structures. So the most primitive parts of our brain are the most powerful when the forefront of our brain, the more evolutionarily advanced parts, the cortex and the prefrontal cortex in particular, have not developed properly. We'll be making reference to that. So there are several structures that are involved in the increasing understanding of what goes on in the brainstem, but the two that are the most important and that I have some thoughts about are the superior colliculi, and it's in the plural, I think mostly because it has layers, and which is a structure that has a proto-sense of seeing, hearing, and sensing. So this is not conscious, but there is an awareness in the being of seeing, hearing, and sensing. It's way before a conscious representation, and way before in the brain, in terms of the brain, is of course milliseconds. And it is, some people's thinking represents a vigilant system separate from a fear system. So the superior colliculus is a key to the vigilance, and I would say to hypervigilance. Associated with it is the periaqueductal gray, separate, but they are tightly connected. And this is the part of the brain that gives rise to threat. And it is not, it used to be that we thought that the amygdala was where this all started, and that was deep enough in the brain for us to wonder if we could ever get to it. The way that I've started to think about the amygdala is that it is in a way a representation of the inner child, the sort of helpless, reactive interior. And maybe in this metaphor of tonight, it's the tiger. But it was the focus, and still to a great level, is the focus of understanding fear reactivity in the human brain. But the research, a good deal of this Ruth Lanius's research, and that's most of the slides you're going to see that come are Ruth's slides, really are focusing on the periaqueductal gray as the initiator of activity in the amygdala, reactivity in the amygdala. It will be fight flight, which is the sympathetic response, or freeze, which is the parasympathetic response. And that begins with a response from the PAG, which has both the possibility of setting up a parasympathetic response and a sympathetic response. Either or typically, but sometimes both. And we won't get into all that tonight, but it's how important the PAG is. It's just, and there, this is the superior colliculus, the one on top, the blue. And this is just to show you how far down in the brain this is. And, you know, as we focus more and more on these structures in the brainstem as the critical initiators, at least, of the trauma response, and we try to think about how we have struggled for years and years in talk therapy and play therapy and all kinds of other approaches, that it's very hard to imagine how we ever got to these structures that were so far down in the brain, and they kept activating with the right stimuli. You got this a level of reactivity, and I'm going to show you this in a second. So, but the second part of this title was "And Let It Sleep," and there's a way in which you could say that my entire career has been about trying to figure out how to get to walk the tiger and to let it sleep. And that is probably true for all trauma therapists and trauma treatment, that their goal, whether it's expressed or not, as I do, is to quiet fear and reactivity. So, as we said, that was quieting the amygdala. Now, everyone, even I think in sort of common parlance, everybody knows that the amygdala is the problem, just in time to find out that, oh no, it's not the amygdala that's the problem. It's deeper in the brainstem. And in recent papers, very recent, sort of hot off the presses, there are, this article, this paper came out August 9th, is also implicating the cerebellum. And this all matters in terms of thinking together about what, where we place the electrode, where should we be exploring? And we'll talk about that toward the end. And we're going to take a look at the problem being the hyperlinking, functional, not structural, hyperlinking between the brainstem and the amygdala. Okay, so this is Alania's slide. This is, we'll discuss this protocol a little bit later, but this is her. I want you to just focus on the red line. Oh. Yeah, find my way. The red line is these are, I can't remember how many, but there are maybe 24 people that are being scanned that have histories of developmental trauma and dissociation. So really what we're looking at with this red line at the top is that 100% of the people that were scanned with this history of unresolved dissociation trauma had disconnectivity between the brainstem, the PAG, and the amygdala. So this shows that connectivity doesn't show the directionality, but the directionality is from the PAG to the amygdala. The PAG is calling these shots. And the lower part of this slide is after one session of alpha down neurofeedback.
No, fuck. Why would I want to do that? Back.
Right, you have to, please mute yourself. Thank you. So this is one session of alpha down. We would not expect this to remain this way. You would in fact expect the opposite. You would expect, if this brain didn't continue to train, that it would default to the upper picture again, because that's what's been practiced for a lifetime. But it shows the potential of changing fundamental connectivity. And not only does it change it, this is 80%. The figure below is 80%, not 100%. Not everybody had this response, but 80%, is a pretty good number, did. And now the connectivity is between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. For any of you who have made it through even one book of Alan Shore's, you know this is what you're looking for in development. This is what comes online fully at age 25, recognized by car rental companies in the States, because you can't rent a car in the United States unless you're 25 or over, because they know the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed. Our justice system will put 13-year-olds in prison for life, but our rental car companies won't rent to kids or people under 25. So there's a real, the rental car companies know something that the justice system fails to recognize. Nonetheless, this changes. And this is meaning that the executive functioning part of the brain, the higher order part of the brain, is now in control. And the PAG is no longer, at this moment of this scan, taking control. So that connectivity that we just saw is could be seen as the red line could be seen as the connectivity of dissociation, and that was a feature of everybody who's being scanned. And it's led me to think a lot about the issue of psychological defenses. And I'm just going to pose this. I'm not going to go into it in any detail because we don't have time, but I just want to question the notion of regression and maybe even of dissociation, depersonalization, and derealization as well. What I have found with working with developmental trauma is that you go along, and people get better and better. This is with neurofeedback, and they get clearer, and they stop having the kinds of reactions that they tend to due to their histories. But then something happens, and in the it could be that they see a car accident, or they're one of my patients who was doing very well returned after her dog was hit and killed in front of her. So those kinds of things, it just triggered her back into, and it could be any number. I mean, triggers are pretty idiosyncratic. So the stimulus, the trigger, in the way that I'm thinking about this, sets off a pattern response in the brain. It's not just neuronal connectivity or hyperlinkage or anything, but there's a whole bloom of pattern that associates with this stimulus, because it's just too big an event for it to be linear in any way. And I think of this as there's a pattern recognition, as a pattern replication and reaction, and that it is very, this is the way that fear-driven brains work. And what happens with that is that the defenses that we think of as, oh, now this person has regressed, they've lost ground, whatever, is that there's fight or flight or dissociation, flashback, any number of possibilities. And this is the brain recognizing and then recognizing that it's under threat, interpreting that it's under threat, and reverting to the pattern that it's known to use threat. And I mean, to respond to threat. And that's, this is not a moment to be discouraged. This just happens. We do see this. And it's a time to either retrain or look at whether our protocols are optimal for our patient. Dissociation, I'm thinking about now as a form of death feigning. This death feigning in the human brain, and it's not a psychological defense as much as it is a physiological defense. And that connectivity pattern, the red line, is, we see it as low arousal, although we'll talk about arousal in a minute. It's not really low arousal, it's freeze. It's a frozen arousal. The heart rate does go down, muscle tone goes away, and people in this state with that level of connectivity can't even call out for their own, to get help. They literally can't use their voices. Okay. So this leads us to a little bit of thought about networks in the brain. The default mode of the three major networks, there are millions of them, but the three major networks that are of concern for us tonight anyway, the default mode network, that's the largest network in the human brain, the executive network, and it's just seeing where they are, right? So the default mode network is here. The central executive network is over here. Can you see my arrow? I don't know if you can see it. Okay. Can you see it? Nod. Okay. And then the salience network takes this on and off. This is the network which switches on. The default mode network switches it off, switches on the executive network. They're not on, at least from what I understand, they're never on at the same time. The salience network, however, is always on. The default mode network looks like the blue and the executive network. So you see that there's a large span front to back of the default mode network. The executive network is mostly in the front, mostly clustered around the prefrontal cortex. The network impairment in developmental trauma is, as you can imagine, this whole body, brain, mind of the person threatened with death from early on in life is wired for threat. The salience network relates to meaning making, so it makes a decision, and it makes a decision in context. So in developmental trauma, it is hyper connected back to the reptilian threat detection system in the back of the brain. Threat for every being is always the most salient feature. But if you have lived under threat for your entire life or for a significant part of your early life, it's just much more so. You are wired for threat, and that is whether you're awake or asleep. The salience network is always on. As Ed Hamlin said to me at one point, the salience network is what allows me to sleep through the traffic outside my window, but to wake if there's a creaking floorboard. Okay, so I thought a very helpful example to understand how the salience network works at night or works when you're asleep. The central executive network relates to judgment and decision making. It's crucial to working memory and the cognitive control of emotion and thought. So I worked for a residential treatment facility for many years, as Jillian mentioned, and I was clinical director there. And I think if we were to summarize what our treatment was, what we were trying to get these kids to be able to do was to count to 10, to just not react immediately to every stim, because almost everything was a stimulus, almost everything was a trigger, or could be rapidly configured into one. So, or think before you act. Well, this was just not happening, right? This is not possible for them. And Bessel did a study of adults who had this same problem with neurofeedback, and he was able to show a 40% increase in executive function in formerly untreatable adults with histories of developmental trauma. So what had come online then was their ability to make good decisions and better judgments, be less impulsive. The whole front part of their brains had come online. That network in the red had come online. The blue should be the executive network and the red should be the default mode network. But anyway, there you go. That whole frontal part of the brain had come online. 40% more so by test. That's the salience in the executive network. The network that's of most importance in our discussion, I think, for tonight, is the default mode network, and this is the default mode network in the controls. So these are the non-traumatized population. And this is now, most of you have probably seen this. This is probably one of the most influential slides in the history of neuroscience, and most specifically in the history of the neuroscience of trauma. And what it's showing is that there is robust blood flow in the back of the brain, where this is the precuneus area down into the lower structures of the brain. This is lit up. This is a good solid blood flow and oxygenation. The front of the and this is the sense of self in time and space. This is a body awareness. This is a sense that you exist at all. Okay, this is existence. This is the narrative of the existence. So that when the one you'll also see is under the condition where the people have been doing a mental math or some sort of task in the scanner, and then they're told they're off task. They don't have to be doing that mental math anymore. And what you see is people showing their, thinking about themselves and other people. Well, as you can see in the PTSD group or the developmental trauma group, what you see is no blood flow in the regions, or very little blood flow in the regions that represent the sense of that you exist in time and space, and hardly any narrative form possibility here. The question will keep occurring. How is psychotherapy happening under these conditions? How is it possible for what is the self-representation, the understanding, the sense of self that people have? What's the condition what's the mentalization possibility for people who don't have structures for self at all? And this is the reality. And we can't change this with our presence, particularly because we don't know that we're there. We can't change it with talk therapy. This is just a description of what we just saw. And I have it on here because the slides will be available to those who want them. Ruth Lanius, that's her slide, in her research, is talking about the default mode network as the self network or the self-other network. And in Alan Shore's work, much of which, if you pick it up again, you read it, you'll see that Ruth Lanius is well represented in his thinking. But it's Affect Regulation and the Origin of Self, the very premise of that book is that affect regulation gives rise to the default mode network. That's a critical piece of information. And affect regulation, as we all know, is a big problem for people who have histories of developmental trauma. Part of the reason for that is that the default mode network doesn't set up. They don't really know that they exist. They don't know that you exist. They haven't had good enough parental attunement, constraint, and protection. So this network does not develop. There's no sense of self, no other. We don't know who's doing the therapy. The DMN also, the default mode network also acts as a brake on fear circuitry. So it's another inhibitory structure in the brain or functional structure. And I think this leaves us with people who have suffered this with a profound felt sense of motherlessness, of no one there. And it's not easy to put that into words if you have a brain that looks like this. It's not easy to articulate the state that you end up feeling if you have a brain that looks like that. But motherlessness is one of the possibilities. So to add to the dilemma, look at this. Okay, so this is the default mode network of the controls that are non-traumatized people. This is developmental trauma more than PTSD. So it's just so we know that PTSD is the shorthand, but it's really developmental trauma, which unfortunately sounds like delirium tremors. So people don't use DTs, but it's and that's probably the only reason. So this is the default mode on the top under controls. This is in the, this is off task. The brain is not really resting. So it's off task. It's obviously very active. The controls are thinking about themselves. You see the same thing in the back of the head, the blood flow in the front of the head. It's all connected. They're thinking about themselves and the dinner they're going to cook, or their kid who scraped their knee or whatever. And the PTSD person, under the same conditions of being off task, has almost disappeared to themselves. There's no connectivity there at all. There's hardly any blood flow except in the very back of the brain. Under threat, however, look what happens. So under threat, so each of these people that were in this study were asked what image would evoke threat for them. And that was the image that was presented to them. It was presented to them subliminally, and they had, and the non-traumatized people, their threat system went off. The PAG activates, as it should. Probably the executive network has come online because they're going to figure out what to do. But the default mode network, the resting state or the off task, they're on task. These people are on task, being formed by threat. What happens to the developmental trauma people? The PAG is definitely activated, and so is the default mode network. So it could be assumed, it would be the best assumption that the only time that with severe trauma, developmental trauma, that the default mode network comes online is under conditions of threat. The very behaviors then that risk our patients' lives and risk the therapy are the behaviors that, like, drug use or prostitution, domestic violence, all of the things that people get involved in that present threat, also give them a fleeting sense of agency and a fleeting sense of self. And those very behaviors which Marshall Lenehan has called therapy, threatening therapy, something, limiting behavior, something like that, are the behaviors that allow for a sense of self. So this is a real confound in our therapy. So it's not only these networks that are a problem. The whole of the system is set up, living in high arousal. So changing networks may quiet fear and reactivity. And I just put in here, Ruth and I were having a conversation, a public conversation at a conference, and we were talking about connectivity training. At that point, what I was doing connectivity training for the default mode network, PZ, or right about here, FZ and PZ, and trying to see if I could bring that online, which I could do. But what happened, what I would see was that I'll tell you the story. So I was training myself. I had a protocol. David Kaiser had helped me put together, and I trained the connectivity of my default mode network. This is quite a ways into during neurofeedback training. And the first time was fine. I didn't notice very much. The second time I trained the connectivity, I went into a depression. And what happens when the default mode network is, rather than not connected, there's no connectivity, is hyper-connected, is that you get obsessive and depressive symptoms. So I never am depressed. That was just not one of the on the list of problems to be solved for me. I felt depression. I had to go and give a talk. I went to give a talk. I came home, and I 2 or 3 days later, and I trained the connectivity in the opposite way, and sure enough, the depression lifted. So there's great promise for this. But as Ruth said, this may be, TMI, too much information for the brain, that this is not subtle, that the possibility of overshooting was great. And she is, as again, we'll talk about with the default mode network, with the alpha down, is training, nudging this default mode network into connectivity, but not making a demand of it. Lowering fear, which is the nature's way to the default mode network, is the parents, mostly the mother, quieting the reactivity of the infant over and over and over and over again, calming the fear, the alarm, the hunger, the pain. Mothers do that hundreds of times a day with babies. And that's the way the default mode network in the wild gets connected. And we can do the same thing, I think, by lowering arousal with neurofeedback. So both of those are worth exploring, but we're not exactly sure now with this new data coming in. We have to be at the back of the head exactly how we're going to do this. But I just wanted to show you just quickly a schematic for arousal. So this is normal arousal. Here is orienting, and everybody, if the door slams where you are, you're going to orient to it. I could tell, even if you're on mute, if you suddenly turned your head, that there had been something that was orienting you. Okay, and babies do this too. They orient with their heads orient very quickly. And I'm ahead of myself. But if you have PTSD, this is a very hyper mouse. I will just talk. Fight or flight, you'll go into sympathetic activation, and the pain system that comes online for sympathetic activation is the endocannabinoid analgesia. And that is marijuana, cannabis. And this is probably one of the reasons that vets there's a big movement in the US anyway, I don't know what this is in Australia, to legalize marijuana for trauma, because it is actually the system that is used to manage the pain and the arousal that goes along with fight and flight. Both systems, both the sympathetic and parasympathetic system, so it keeps building. So if you don't stop in fight and flight, it keeps building, you get to a place where both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic activation are at their highest, and there's what's called tonic immobility, and this is a nervous system that both things are happening at once. That keeps going, which it usually does. You go into what's called emotional shutdown or collapse immobility, and there can be a compromised consciousness, i.e. dissociation, parasympathetic activation. It's now the pain system is directly related, at least according to Ruth, to the amount of physical pain and suffering that this person went through in the original scenario, whether it's going to be endocannabinoids or opioids. So the brain is responding to the original conditions, and you're flooded with endogenous opioids. And essentially the front part of your brain is offline. You're cortically out of it. And this is depersonalization, derealization, dissociation. And if that goes on for too long, you're going to have, you could lose consciousness or you could faint. And our job in neurofeedback is to move the dissociative patient, the severely traumatized patient back through this curve, back through tonic immobility, back into fight or flight. And I've had several patients who would have thought of themselves as victims that's how they would respond if they were to be assaulted. They would found themselves knowing that they would now fight. And that was the change in this system. Okay, so we're looking at the brain, and what's important in this field is that we toss out the DSM. We have to just purge it from our thinking because it isn't true. There's no discrete diseases like they say in the DSM. There's absolutely none. And this is, although I don't know that Oliver Sacks was taking on the DSM, but this is his representation of what an unstable brain, how it manifests. Okay, this is a book he wrote in 1985, showing that the Jacksonian level is the amplitude of the event, and the rest of this grid is the duration of the event. And he's showing from his point of view that epilepsy and migraine and manic depressive or bipolar illnesses, all the same problem over a different amplitude and different time scale. And we use this as we think about all of these things as discrete problems in the brain, and the brain just doesn't see it that way. So, okay, every time I do this, this gets caught. It should make me not use the slide, but I like it so much that I do. Okay, I'll get back online here. So in the DSM diagnoses in a study done at the University of Liverpool are scientifically meaningless. To think new thoughts about what we are dealing with requires setting the DSM aside. The mental illness is a brain problem, and way before it is a psychological problem and developmental trauma that begins in the upper brainstem. I just want to say, when you try to figure out, so where is the problem in the brain? The problem is in the frequency domain. Frequency is a fundamental aspect of our being. It's an essential property. It's not a byproduct. We are doing frequency medicine. That is what we're about. frequency therapy, for those who don't want to put it in the medicine category, frequency therapy. We look right by this reality, even as we use the language that signifies it. So we use words like attunement, and I get the vibe and resonance. We can reach the frequency domain of reality most meaningfully in the brain. It's its language, it's its organizing principle, it's the language of neurofeedback, and this is how we interface with a nervous system to quiet it down. If all goes well, and this is the experience of the baby, we are in rhythm, attunement, and resonance, the original attuned interpersonal dance. This is what's going on here. This is organizing in the frequency domain of this baby. And the mother's attunement and the regulation of her baby's state and the baby's reciprocity. So it's a mutual resonance. So if the baby has a neurological deficit, this could also not be set up. And that cause great distress for the mother, is the core of attachment. And as we know from Alan Shore, the attachment provides the foundation of a sense of self. This is the other problem. This is the other dilemma. This is the attachment rupture, or perhaps attachment never developing at all. There's a ongoing study that is authored by Lyons Ruth, and looking at what predicts borderline personality disorder. And the prediction that the abuse washes out as a predictor, which is stunning, right? Abuse of the child, it does not predict a borderline personality. What predicts it, and I don't buy any of these diagnoses, right? I hope you just know that, because I've just thrown that book out. Okay, but this is the premise of this study. The mother who withdraws, and the baby who keeps trying to get her to attend. That is the dilemma in therapy that we think of as the borderline dilemma. That is lack of resonance. That is lack of alignment. And the attachment rupture, and these are the patients that the whole field turns away from. I saw someone's statistic saying that there are 14 million borderline personality patients. That's a stunning number. Okay, anyway, attachment rupture or breakdown of mutual resonance is the core issue in developmental trauma. Neglect, and I have abuse now in brackets because that's not showing up, right? In early childhood, leave a brain that cannot organize itself, that is out of tune with itself and others through the original and repeated failure of rhythmic attunement. We are right where we need to be because rhythmic attunement is the issue. So what are we to do? The protocols that I am looking at most often now are at the back of the head. So Alpha Down is Ruth's protocol. I've had mixed results with that, but other people are just seeing astounding results. And I don't have large numbers anymore. So I think I'm just saying that by way of transparency, but not because I think this seems to have a lot of it's a very useful protocol. And as I mentioned before, she thinks this is nudging the default mode network into place. What we saw was the complete change as I showed you earlier in that slide, the connectivity between the PAG and the amygdala changes to connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, and that's the whole goal. That's the whole developmental goal of how the brain it's the way it's supposed to go in ideal circumstances. So she's got very good data. This is very useful. And all it is PZ. There's a question about which reference. I would use reference to the right ear And you're just doing any way you can with whatever system you've got, you're training alpha down. You're just saying, don't make alpha. And in what the brain does in its own way is to make more alpha. It normalizes alpha. Actually, most developmental trauma people have too little alpha, and but some have too much. In each case, it seems to respond to an alpha down protocol. The other thing that we've been exploring is training at the Inion Ridge. So training right where you learn to measure from. And if you doubt that it's its own signal, you put 2 electrodes on, and one at OZ and one at Inion Ridge, IZ, right at the top of the Inion Ridge, and you'll see the difference. And usually the Inion Ridge signal is even more robust. To get to the cerebellum and is O1 minus O2 or the Inion Ridge, both seem to, even though the signal is different, both at least have geographical relationships with the cerebellum and obviously with the occipital region as well. The occipital region, when I started using O1 minus O2, I would use it for, I was using it with 2 people who had come in, had had head injuries and had blurred vision. So the acute injuries that week, the week before. And their vision cleared up in the chair at O1 minus O2. And the next week they both came in, they didn't know each other, they weren't talking, and they both reported less anxiety. And I said, well, how's that possible? I mean, that's just the occipital region. This is all about eyes, right? And eyesight. Well, it's not all about eyes and eyesight. The cuneus, the cuneus and the precuneus, this is the top of this, PZ is the precuneus. The cuneus is a major inhibitory part of the brain that is in the occipital domain. It's in the occipital cortex. Connectivity training, which we've talked a little bit about. I'm not going, if we have time, we'll do questions. And it may be that it was yet to be discovered where we need to put our electrodes and what frequencies. Typically, these from the Inion Ridge on down, these are low frequencies, or the Inion Ridge and O1 minus O2, low rewards, meaning 5 to 8 or below. And I typically do these no longer than 6 minutes. So you start, I don't know, it kicks back. So it's a 6-minute or 3-minute protocol, depending on the person's response to this. And I just want to say that I've gotten recently to know Frank Corrigan, who has developed a therapy that Ruth turned me on to this, and she introduced me to Frank. This is his paper. Mariana's got it available for all of you if you want it, I think. This is maybe another approach where he is really in a conversation with the brainstem. It's quite interesting. So some of you may know, we're getting to the end here. Some of you may know that Marsha Lenehan and I have known each other since we were both teenagers. And we talked a lot, and she was in Seattle, and we've been friends for all these years. And we had a conversation 5, 6, 7 years ago at most on DBT. And obviously, she's got a lot of positive feelings about DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, as she should. But she said to me, well, I hope whatever you this may have been longer ago. She said, I hope neurofeedback is better than DBT. I can get people's behavior shaped up, but I can't get to their core misery. Okay. because attachment rupture is the core issue in developmental trauma, we have, as therapists, have to use an attachment-focused therapy. And DBR is one of those. Most of you are engaged in some form of attachment-focused therapy, or at least you're aware that attachment is the goal. We're not sidelined by neurofeedback. We are essential to this process of helping traumatized people gain a self and other. We are the other. You are the devoted other. We are the devoted other. It's the quality of your presence. And as I like to say, good enough mothering, good enough parenting gives rise to good enough regulation affect, and good enough neurofeedback gives rise to good enough affect regulation too. So we are, our goal is to provide both. So to end, I'm going to read a letter that I received that is somebody who had been doing a lot of training. This is not somebody that I worked with. This is somebody who was doing therapy elsewhere and started doing Indian Ridge training. And it's just a way of giving you an idea of the complexity of the well, not of the training. The training is pretty straightforward, but what people are trying to find their way out of and organize a new sense of self. Hi, Seaburn. I'm writing to tell you about a new experience I'm having. It seems like it's a strong testament to the potential of neurofeedback. I've talked about the disorientation I experienced when fear calmed. How do I proceed in the world without fear, particularly a world complicated by a lingering pandemic, i.e. a world that was hallmarked by fear? Recently, I've experienced a distinct but unexpected absence of reactivity, which seems different from the absence of fear, and I agree with her, around decades-old series of traumatic experiences. In the 1990s, I was one of the first women in the country to file a lawsuit against their father for incest. A close friend confronted her father about incest at about the same time I did. Recently, she and I spoke on the phone for 7 hours about incest and incest family dynamics and their histories in more detail I won't go into. I'm writing to you because I realized after a steady flow of painful memories of abuse, neglect, etc., the reactive physiological response I've always had during these conversations was gone. Capital G-O-N-E, gone. For the first time, my physiology was quiet. I wasn't reacting to the conversation with adrenaline. My brain didn't overwhelm and it didn't collapse during the conversation or after. This seems nothing short of a miracle. Similar to the absence of fear, the absence of reactivity is disorienting. What do my past traumatic experiences mean in the absence of reactivity? This is a profound question. If sensations don't overwhelm me and I can think about these things, then what will these experiences mean? Who was I? Who am I now? I don't have any experience thinking about these things without overwhelming body sensations that shut down thinking. I have nothing to pivot to. Disorientation is only part of it. Without overwhelming sensations, my mind feels like an empty white space. It almost echoes in there. I feel like an adult without a history. I'm lost in the light or invisible in the light. What do I do so I don't lose my mind again as my mind processes this without reactivity as I work this through with my therapist? There's also an emergence of a pureness about the state, a serenity about it, an emergence of new life. It's not frightening. I'm lost in my mind, but I've never felt more present in my body or in the room. My friend and I talked about how much we loved talk therapy in the 90s, how we benefited from therapists teaching us about family dynamics. Somatics is an important piece in trauma treatment, but it isn't enough. Sometimes treatment stops with regulation of sensation. Some of us will want talk therapy, understanding and clarity about our histories without fear and reactivity. Neurofeedback takes away our defenses from the trauma. Regulation isn't enough. Psychotherapy matters a lot too. If you're still reading, thank you for everything. I'm one of the lucky ones getting out of darkness and moving toward peace. I'll just share my response. Thank you for sharing this deep, profound reflection. I think I know what you're experiencing. What is this mind? What meaning is to be made of all that historical horror if one no longer reacts to it? It is new ground, a new ground of being. You are stepping out of a powerful field. Where are you then? What organizes you with a capital Y? This is, for me, where the Buddhists come in. This is the terrifying and often grieved loss of the ego. It is not, however, much as it might feel this way, loss of your mind. That's the former and inevitable paradigm of trauma. This is a beautifully written description of the new field in which I practice, on retreat, and in every morning's meditation. Welcome here. Thank you all very much.
Seaburn, thank you so much. That was incredible. I hope I can present some of that information as eloquently as you have to some of the child safety officers that we have up here who are still hesitant to send their kids over for neurofeedback. Incredible information. Thank you as always.
Oh, thank you, Nia. And, you know, this is coming in fast and furious, particularly the stuff about the brainstem. So we can't reach it. Nobody could make a claim that we can reach the brainstem with any of the therapies we're presently doing that are not related to some form of neurofeedback. Maybe DBR, I mean, but that is a very intensive therapy itself. And I think, Mariana, hopefully you're going to be exploring with Frank to get this into Australia too. He's lovely and it's brilliant. But thank you, Nia. It's all yours. Take it.
Thank you. Are we allowing time for questions? Do we have time for questions?
Yes, we have 10 minutes. So we are inviting now everyone to ask questions.
Oh, Jillian, go for it.
Thanks, Seaburn. That was really interesting. I'm thinking about one of the slides you showed about Ruth's work, looking at controls and PTSD and the default mode network. And you were saying that for the, that one. So for the developmental trauma clients, the default mode network is active when they're in threat. Did I hear that right?
That's right.
Okay. That solves a bit of a problem for me. As you know, I've been talking with yourself and with Ruth about a discrete group of clients who have had a recurrence of self-harm after Alpha Down training, after an absence of more than a year of not self-harming, and then we do Alpha Down and they self-harm in the week following. And last week makes the 6th such person. And I've had other clients with developmental trauma who've had a very different and amazing response to Alpha Down, which is why I kept using it. But it makes me wonder, in those clients, are we kind of activating a state which for them is associated with, like, is there some pattern recognition there about when we activate the default mode network, which is what Alpha Down is intended to do, what goes with that for them is injury to the body. And so it's got me wondering. I was thinking, wow, I wonder if it's that kind of correlation that they're making, not in a conscious way. Keen to hear your thoughts about that.
Well, it's a very interesting question. I am not sure, and I've questioned this, that this formation that we're seeing on the in the lower right-hand corner is relates to self-harm. I think it relates to threat. And self-harm isn't a threat in this population. Self-harm is an attempt to shut down a mounting pressure in the nervous system, in the way that I see it, and the way that people have described it to me. That is unbearable what's coming. It's not, there's not a greater sense of agency when people are engaged in self-harm. It isn't, I think it's, this is going to be impossible to ever see on fMRI, right? Because you can't have people engaged in self-harm and see, oh, is that different? So it's completely a hypothesis. But if I listen carefully to the imperative, so let's say I'm right, and I'm just winging this, Joanne, because I don't know, right? But let's say I'm right about that. This doesn't relate. This particular threat. It's not about threat. The self-harm. What might it be? To suddenly, have that network active outside of conditions that has ever been known. I mean, I don't know what the interior experience would be, and I don't know what the neurological experience is either. I don't know what, if there's something that then has to be interrupted, because that's what I think self-harm is about. It's an imperative to interrupt the rising tide of an over-aroused nervous system. It's unbearable, and it switches the pattern from the fear network to the pain network. And Marshall Linehan would suggest that, do anything, don't, create pain, but don't create tissue damage. So, you hold an ice cube, or, plunge your head into ice water, right? Those things will stop the impulse to self-harm as effectively as cutting, but that's not usually what people think to do. So, but I can't elaborate on that more, but I think it's a really important finding. And what do you do? What did you stop doing alpha down when that happens? What do you do?
At the client's request, on a couple of occasions, we've stopped. We're never doing that again. And we've returned to other just stabilizing protocols and ongoing therapy. And for 4 of the 6, we've just very slowly and gradually introduced alpha down. And over time, it's gotten to the point where it gives them that similar kind of grounded, felt sense of here and now and calm. But that's taken months. Yeah.
And, given the research that we're also, just tapping into a little bit in this talk, you might want to be thinking about Indian Ridge, or, and I'm not even sure we're there with Indian Ridge. It may be that we need to go beneath not on the top of the ridge, below. It may not be that we can reach this any better than we're already doing. We don't know. But we know that that's where the action is. It's in the back of the head. And maybe, we've got to go and find what protocol, not maybe, if we can possibly do it, we're going to go to the back of the head and find the protocol that quiets fear. Terry, did you have a question?
Oh, hi, Sebern.
Hi.
Unmute. When I work with people with adults with PTSD and also kids with ADHD, I notice bursts of 3 hertz. And I'm wondering whether it's the PAG that might be creating those bursts of 3 hertz. You ever had any experience with that?
I don't know. No, I don't. I see, I don't see bursts characteristically as a sort of high amplitude slow wave as a part of the picture in trauma, and it could very well center around 3 hertz, but the inhibit that I use is typically 1 to 6.
Right. Mhm.
Right. And so that would cover that 3 hertz. And if that, and every time it bursts, it just stops the reward. I mean, it stops you don't get a reward. So the brain learns not to do that anymore. I mean, this is a brain misbehaving, right? This is a brain misbehaving for all the reasons we discussed. But it is, I just, I don't know. Are you training at the back of the brain, Terry? Are you training in Ridge or, okay.
No.
You might want to see, I mean, this finding about anticipatory anxiety just blew my mind, that both of these people who visions got better, who had the O1 minus O2 training for the vision problem, both came in and said, I feel less anxious. And we just explored that a little because everything was about anxiety, right? That's the way everything I was doing was about trying to quiet anxiety, fear. Anxiety to me is the domesticated version of fear, terror, actually. And everything was to try to quiet that down. And now, so it surprised me that they could now recognize something a little different about that. And the difference was that there wasn't anticipatory anxiety. It's as though you had just pulled the brain, put reins on the brain and pulled it back from, jumping over the cliff or getting ahead of itself and back. My Asperger's, traumatized Asperger's patient said, I used to live, I used to live out here and now I live here. And then here and then here, and now I live here. It's like she came right back into her own brain and she centered herself in this. And that was the O1 minus O2 protocol. So it's a, and I just think the data is taking us to the back. That's all. So I just share that with you and you take it where you will.
Lovely. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Terry. Martin, I guess I'm calling people. And Martin.
Could you be very specific about the training protocols that you've mentioned?
What more specifics could I give you? Tell me.
Well, first of all, the references, unless they've been mentioned. So you mentioned O1 minus O2. Is that eyes open training? What kind of report, what kind of presentation, what kind of feedback do you use or recommend?
Okay, so this is going to be true for the Indian Ridge and O1 minus O2. So it's a 1 to 6.
Okay, when you say Indian Ridge, what's the reference when you train Indian Ridge?
It's right on the Indian Ridge. So it's where you begin to measure the brain from. So it's IZ. I don't know how to show you, but there.
Okay. Indian Ridge minus what?
Right here. Good, thank you. Right here, you could do Indian Ridge 1 and 2 as a interhemispheric protocol, also help. And it's 1 to 6 inhibit in both cases. I use a 1 to 6 inhibit always. Not alpha down doesn't use inhibits. And the frequencies are typically 5 to 8 or below. Thank you for this question, Martin. Are 5 to 8 and below. And the Indian Ridge, well, both, but the Indian Ridge even more, is very, very sensitive to reward. So even
you're saying 5 to 8 hertz reward, yeah?
Yes, and a 1 to 6 inhibit. 5 to 8 reward, and you can have on the 22 to 36 for muscle tension as well. But you're really looking at the frequency of the reward, and it can be very low. It can be as low as 0 to 3. It can be typically, and this is can be a very useful protocol for sleep. I think that's because the reticular activating system is back there, and the local effects are stronger than non-local effects. So you're going to find the frequency that works. But I think about in the Indian Ridge that 4 to 7 is high training at the Indian Ridge. 0 to 3 is low training, and everything in between is where you're going to probably end up being for most people. So, and
just ask how long you would typically train for.
I did mention that it would be 3 to 6 minutes max, and it could be as little as 1 minute. But I don't train these back of the brain more than 6 minutes typically, because it's like with FPO2, for whatever reason, these particular areas seem to be reactive to long sets of training. And I can't tell you why, but it's just what I've seen.
And what do you use as feedback presentation? Is it eyes open, eyes closed training? Is it sounds? What do you use?
Eyes open with a game, typical, whatever you're using for feedback should work, just as it does everywhere else. And as you'll see, Martin, if you put the electrode on the Indian Ridge and you take a look at, you'll see how robust the signal it is. There's something very important that is being represented in the frequency domain of the brain at the Indian Ridge.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question. Hi, Darius.
Hi, Seaburn. Fantastic talk again. Thank you. I was just wondering about that modification of Chaucer and Elbert's slide, and you were talking about cannabinoids and opioids. I was wondering the Chaucer and Elbert adaptation, where you've got, yes, that one. Next one down. Yes, this one. You were talking about cannabinoids and opioids.
Yeah.
I was wondering what your experience is in terms of EEG patterns you would see there, and if there were any sort of clinical symptoms that you would link to either of those styles of neurochemistry or responding.
Well, they're always going to be connected, right, Darius, with the clinical presentation. So I'm not, I'm just talking about what the underlying chemical influences are in these presentations. So this is the vet, the fight or flight is the vet who, who swings at somebody in the grocery store because he's startled, right? And the clinical presentation of the collapse in mobility is in dissociation. So people are experiencing dissociation, depersonalization, derealization. And what we're saying is that it makes even more sense when you understand that addressing pain is part of what the brain does, and it needs a stronger analgesia with people who have endured whatever they've endured, that they go into a collapsed immobility. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that sprung to my mind is that I see a lot of clients that have frontal alpha, and we know that cannabinoids increase frontal alpha coherence. It's also, a subvigilant state, but I wondered if there was any association there with cannabinoids. And then, Terry was talking about the 3 Hertz delta bursts, and we know that delta can be associated with opioids. So I was wondering if there was any connection there.
You have to answer the question, Darius, and I will look forward to your answer. Okay. So no, I really do. I'm not just putting you on the spot. I would really look forward to your digging into that question and presenting on it. Yeah.
That would be my guess, but I know that sleep plays a massive influence in both of those patterns and homeostatic dysregulation. So I don't know either.
Okay, well, but you'll figure it out. I know you will.